This is Scott Conway, Grandmaster Scott with 1T, talking with people that you might passionately disagree with. I'm going to show you a conversation I actually had, a conversation on a friend's thread. And, and Larissa is a brilliant publicist. She works from out of the country. So she's not even in the United States, but even so, she's just done with some things. One of the things that she was complaining about is that she is just done with the tone deaf who tried out all lives matter in the middle of this moment, in the middle of this emotion. That's one of the things she expressed that she was tired of. Well, I jump in on a conversation in here and I talk a little bit about some of my core principles and what I'm talking about. But is it any surprise that somewhere down this thread, as we're having an otherwise pretty nice conversation, because my core principles are reality is more important than anything we believe. All principles must be consistently applied. Fairly non-controversial, but stuff that warrants a serious and deep conversation. And a little after there, while I'm having this conversation, someone jumps in with, of course, all lives matter. Is anybody surprised? Well, rather than just let it turn into a fight, because when someone specifically says this is one of the things that they're tired of, and someone jumps in and does it, that can be somewhat provocative. But we engage in a conversation. Now, I had my things to say there, and so I broke all of that out. But I ended with, you respond to Black Lives Matter with all lives matter. I'm open to the conversation. Shall we have it? And so he says, so whose lives don't matter? And I do a bit of an explanation about what's going on and how it matters. And he says, I'm not interested in debating this word salad you dished out. I'm asking you one specific question: whose lives don't matter? So he's being pretty forceful still. So at this point, we're still in conflict mode. More specifically, he's in conflict mode. And so I responded, you're not interested in having the discussion. Curious. Well, let me summarize my discussion unpacked above. The reality on the ground, Black lives don't matter as much as white lives. The proposition by BLM, Black lives do matter. And his proposition is stop stoking racial divisiveness and protect all lives equally. Okay, now, is anyone opposed to protecting all lives equally? I don't think anyone's opposed to that. So, okay, we have a point of agreement. Now, stop stoking racial divisiveness. How many of us want more racial divisiveness? I would like to think none of us want more. What we want is to have it resolved. Now, which technique does one or the other largely depends upon your principles and your philosophy and the fact set that you're experiencing. So I have a point of entry here based upon a point of agreement. So I said, so if all lives are not being protected equally, would you agree that it is appropriate for a specific group whose lives are not being protected to stand up and say that their lives matter too? Now I started off saying, well, no, it's not, because he's in still fight picking mode. Law enforcement needs to protect all citizens equally. Okay, we all agree with that. That's not in argument, or not anything we're arguing on. It's like it is inappropriate to single out any group for any reason. Well, we agree with that too. So he just made two statements that I think pretty universally we agree with. And so I don't, it's like in your opening sentence, you imply if the police were racially targeting, a particular group, that they can't complain. But your first clause in your second sentence is exactly the point. Law enforcement needs to protect all citizens equally. So that's the inarguable point. Because I don't imagine anyone's going to argue, well, no, law enforcement needs to be racist. Law enforcement needs to be sexist. Law enforcement needs to be prejudiced. No one's making that argument. Just like no one's making the argument that Black lives don't matter. It's not Black lives do matter versus Black lives don't matter. No one's agitating for Black lives not mattering. That's not where the complaint is. That's not what the argument's about. So in the second clause, that creates an impression stated above, if a group is not being protected equally, is he making the argument that they cannot and should not be permitted to state that grievance? Now note that because my tone is non-combative, I am drawing him into a reasonable discussion. And then we get to the point. He says, I don't see any evidence the police is targeting any specific group differently. Now, in his defense, anecdotal individual cases don't show the pattern of what's going on, because You could trot out anecdotal individual cases. If all you need is like a dozen cases, you can find probably a dozen cases on any side because the police literally kill 1,000 people a year. And so if you have a sample set of 1,000 people and you only have to pull out 5 or 10 of them to state your case, you can probably find 5 or 10 to state a case. So this is where he's coming from. It's like, okay, so the implication when he says, I don't see any evidence that they're targeting any specific group differently, then that tells us like, okay, so if there is evidence that the police are targeting a specific group differently, would you be open to that evidence? And so he just created an opening. Okay, here's a place we can have a rational, factual discussion. And he has some other things, and I even say, now we're getting somewhere. So asserting all lives that matter is an invalidation of a more specific Black Lives Matter makes much more sense if your proposition is that Blacks are not treated differently by police. So thus, by your proposition, you're any disparity, and then someone else jumped in there, and then, but back to Demetrius says, yep, you got it. Justice needs to be colorblind. Don't bring special interest agendas into policing. And we go, okay. Now, do we agree or disagree with that? Should justice be colorblind? Should we keep special interest agendas out of policing, including a special interest agenda of racism, special interest agendas of sexism, special interest agenda of religionism? I don't think that's an actual word. And then we ended up on a side issue that was jumping into white privilege, which totally was backfiring in there. But then I continue my conversation with them. So excellent. So we have a better understanding. Again, on your second sentence, I absolutely 100% agree with you on the first clause. Justice does need to be colorblind. I semi-agree with your second clause with a caveat. Special interest should never dictate color, or should never derail colorblind justice. But if justice is not colorblind, would you object to a group that rightly or wrongly perceives that they are unjustly targeting to declare that they believe they're being unfairly targeted? And so now note, the way I'm making the argument is I'm not arguing with his factual assertion. I've left a factual assertion behind for a different discussion because we could have that discussion. What I'm investigating here is at a principle level. If they believe they're being unfairly treated, would it make sense for someone to say, hey, I think I'm being unfairly treated? And we're looking at getting it down to the principle level because, now this is part of the because, if we end up arguing over the facts, and it turns out the facts was just a smokescreen, that's not actually his issue, he actually hasn't committed, then we don't resolve anything. And so, I said, let's take a moment to slide back to history. I'm Sansei, third generation Japanese immigrant. My grandparents on my mother's side were Issei, the first generation immigrants from Japan during World War II. We locked up our Japanese immigrants, like we, United States, and our Japanese American citizens, even through Sansei, third generation, even the citizens. And if there was a movement that said, Japanese American freedom matters, would you believe it was an appropriate response to the reality that we are historically aware of, or would you feel that the most appropriate response to such a proposition would be, well, all freedom matters? I'm 80% sure that you'd feel a group-specific claim would be appropriate because we know factually that one group was targeted. And I'm assuming that if we were going to debate the issue with you, the effective place to have the discussion is by looking at known, knowable, or reasonably inferred criminal activity in the Black community and see if it completely explains the difference in treatment by police. And if it does, then your proposition stands. And if it doesn't, then the BLM proposition stands. Does that sound like it would be a fair way to address that? And then, we went back and, well, there's no proof that anything police have prevented from doing their jobs and such. And I just told him, okay, as a non-white person, I'd rather leave white privilege out of it. As between you and I, Dimitri, let's just leave it out. I just like the argument for a lot of reasons, but based on your factual assertions, if I agreed with you that the police are in fact colorblind, then that leads to one proposition. And so, and when you see how I'm handling it, I'm engaging him in discussion. And this is where we ended with him. As you may have noticed, most people who engage on politics are not interested in a reasoned discussion. Most are interested in shouting, forming factions, and demeaning their opponents. Human nature hasn't changed in thousands of years. To which I respond, I have most definitely noticed, and I do hope to help people rise above that now. Unfortunately, some of that got derailed. But then, as we work our way down the conversations, I did get a response from someone that came back to me directly that said that he was amazed at how that went. And part of the simple trick of all of it is to engage in the discussion, because so much of him coming around and so much of finding that common ground happened because we had the discussion, because we looked for our commonalities. And when we find our commonalities, that also tells us how to have the conversation. So if everybody really honestly is treated exactly equally, would we agree that there's no need for one group to stand up and say, hey, no, I'm not being treated equally? And we both agreed, yes, they should be treated equally. And then when eventually we work around, say, okay, so if someone is being treated unequally, and I use the Japanese Americans as an example because right now, that was so long ago that we don't have a lot of emotion about it right now in this particular crisis. We just recognize that as a historical fact. Yeah, we put the Japanese people into internment camps. And when we put Japanese people into an internment camps, would it have made sense for people to say Japanese freedom matters, Japanese American freedom matters? Or would you respond, well, all freedom matters? Well, yes, all freedom does matter, but the only people we're putting in camps right now are the Japanese Americans. And so when we begin to look at some of these things factually, you go, okay, and you engage in the discussion. So what if I worked for him? And if we just have a head-butting conflict, it could be my job, it could be my career, because these things like, okay, I can't have this in my business. I'm not having this attitude with my clients in the business. What if this was me headbutting or talking with a major client? If I headbutt with a major client, I could lose the client. If I can engage a major client who I might passionately disagree with, but I can engage and we can have a discussion. And at the very least, even if they still disagree with my ending proposition, it's like, well, this guy was pretty reasonable about that. And that we can show how reasonable we can be as we engage in this discourse so that we can have influence, so that we can make a difference, so that we can maintain our relationships that are necessary to lead our teams, to be on teams, to engage in business, to have careers, to have extended family, to have circles of friends that don't always have to agree with us 100% on every single issue. And note that I didn't learn this on the hard issues. I do this on the hard issues, but I learned it and I practiced it on the easier ones. Learning how to have the conversation, even with people I disagree with, so that if we will stay engaged, we can get somewhere. And at the very least, find some common ground that we can now use as a basis to develop some kind of solution. So this is Scott Conway, Grandmaster Scott with 1T. I'm giving stuff away at scottwith1t.com that will help with all of this. So feel free to go there, SCOTWITH, the number 1, and then the letter T.com.